So good morning, everybody. Welcome to this strategy cafe this morning on how we have evolved during the pandemic. So I hope you're all having a great week so far. You've got your coffee with you. We're just waiting for a few more people to join, but we'll kick off. So I'm Roseanna. I'm a strategy facilitator at Alembic, and I'll be leading today's webinar. For those of you who haven't tuned into our previous strategy cafes, this is our monthly webinar, which aims to share insight on key leadership themes. So our usual format is an interview with some remarkable leader who shares their story and their journey and their learnings along the way. So really its purpose is to share leadership insights from some stories. But in this special series, Nick and Matt and I have been discussing the leadership themes that have come out of the pandemic, how we have shifted as leaders and what that means for the organisations that we work in. So today we're going to be talking about how the pandemic has shifted our sense of who we are, where we belong, our identity, and this both being our personal identity, but also in an organisation, that's your brand. So this is actually the third and the penultimate one in the series. So the previous ones you can check out on the website. And the next one is coming up in May. We would like this to be as interactive as possible. So we'd welcome any comments as they arrive. You can just share them and any questions you have as well. And we are going to be using the chat area. So previously we've used the questions area, but we're actually going to make this a little bit more open and interactive. So we're going to be using the chat area this week. No worries, we'll be checking the questions area if you accidentally put one in there, but just so we can start a conversation around some of these themes and see what other people are raising as questions and thoughts. So hopefully it will be interactive. The webinar will go up till 9 AM and then we will just stick around for questions, which on the theme of identity, quite a complex topic, so you might have lots of questions and that's fine, we'll try and answer them. So let's get started. So I suppose identity, we've all been on a journey through the pandemic and we each all have our own unique story of how the crisis has unfolded for us and impacted us, and that both been at home and at work. In the previous strategy cafe, we were talking about what has the loss of place, the loss of that sense of being together, how has that impacted on how we are together, how we communicate, and what the emergent culture of where we work, who we work with, what the emergent culture of organisations is. So in this strategy cafe, it's quite a nice lead on from culture into a sense of who we are and how our identity has been impacted. And that might have changed for you, but also those around you. So I suppose, have you yet thought about how the virus has changed the way we look at ourselves? Have you thought about how others' identity may have impacted? So it's changed our relationship with ourselves, but also our relationship with our world and what we see value in that. So this webinar just tackles some of those quite big questions. So the agenda for today, well, I'll introduce my colleagues in a moment. I'll let them say a bit about who they are. But we will then talk about how we've changed, how that has impacted our belief system. So what's the relationship between our belief system and our identity? And then we'll also talk about the impact on organisations and brands, and then we'll have time for some summary and questions that you may have. So just would like to introduce my colleagues who I have joining me on today's webinar. So Matt, perhaps you'd like to kick off and just introduce yourself.
Morning everyone, I'm Matt. I'm one of the strategy facilitators and client managers at Alembic. My background is in healthcare, and at Alembic I help leaders from all different sectors with some of their most challenging issues, and that's with coaching, education, facilitation with small teams or large groups, all kinds of different things.
And hello everybody, I'm Nick. So I'm founder of Alembic, and it's our just into our 5th birthday at the moment. So we started in April 2016. My background is as a chartered accountant in mid-sized professional firm where I spent most of my career, and bringing together experience as a child in a Buddhist center, working with my wife, who was professionally a physiotherapist, with those sort of commercial skills from accounting into Alembic. So that's a bit of my background.
Thank you both. So, identity. What do we mean by identity? So I suppose this question is, do you know who you are? And how strong is your sense of yourself? So while we've all had to shift in the past year, we've all experienced that shift in different ways. Now, one of the ways we can think about identity is we hold lots of different identities. So you might be a leader in a business, you might be a parent, you might be a golfer, a swimmer. And the reason why we're talking about identity is that having a strong sense of who we are is at the root of our decision making, our behaviours at work. And so really working on understanding our identity, having greater clarity on who you are is an important leadership quality and trait to bring consistency of decision making and therefore trust. So I want to take you back to February last year. And perhaps you were caught up in Storm Ciara. I'm not sure, maybe it was Storm Dennis. I can certainly recall landing at Gatwick after a lovely, boozy skiing holiday with friends and landing in one of those storms and it being actually quite frightening. But you know, that was holidays, it was going abroad, it was being with friends, and since then I've actually moved out of London, away from friends, haven't had a holiday. We've got a puppy, we've got a house to renovate. I certainly have a different life, and I suppose we maybe all feel like we've got a slightly different life, but does that mean our identity has changed? So to get a feel for the shift, I want you to transport yourself back to February last year. Do you remember the storm? What were you doing? Who were you then? What was your identity? So just take a moment and just pause. What things are coming to your mind? And I suppose the question then is, who are you now and what's different? Because maybe you've had a big shift, maybe you've had a small shift, maybe there's no shift, but actually just recognizing, you know, what things that you identify with, what makes up your identity is really important. So just wanted to do a poll. I suppose, can we just bring up the poll? So to what extent has your identity changed? So select any of the following. So not at all, it's slightly changed, it's moderately changed, it's considerably changed, or it's changed a great deal. I'll just let a few more of you vote. Okay, I think we can sort of close the poll. Okay, so that's really interesting. So actually most of you feel a slight shift or moderate shift, or no real change at all. So most of you haven't felt a big shift in any way. Our next question, can we pull up that one for the poll? So selecting a person that you work with. So thinking about other people that surround you. Do you think their identity has changed? So to what extent has their identity changed? So the same question, but just thinking about others. Bit of a harder question, hard to know. I think we can close there. So interestingly, very, very similar response there. So I hope, you know, going through this sense of identity will give you a sense of, even where you feel like your identity hasn't shifted, actually bring greater clarity to what that identity is for you. And I suppose it's worth just saying the reason why we're talking about this is just so we can better tune into ourselves, how we can understand the impact, even if there is sort of no change to your identity, just understanding how that might have impacted others and those that we work with. So one way to think about the extent of change on who we are is using this model called logical levels. So this is a visual representation to show that we experience change at different levels. So this can be any change. This can be moving job, moving house, a corporate reorganization, having children, trying something new. And so this relates to any change, not just a pandemic. But some of the changes that we experience affect our behaviour, and some affect our capabilities, and some affect our sense of who we are, our identity. So there are different levels here. So this was actually developed by a man called Robert Dilts in the 70s, and thinking of these different levels as stepping stones to help us make change in our lives, so that we can become more aligned with each level in order to achieve that overall purpose in life, get a greater sense of who we are. So what do I mean by that? So when we are going through change, we can use the different levels to examine the impact of change on who we are. What's the impact on the change on us? And this can be hugely beneficial to us as leaders to gain insight into how staff might be affected at each level in certain scenarios. So for example, when you're implementing change at work. So this could be at an environmental level. So if we take the pandemic, at an environmental level, this is where the majority of us have felt the change. So lockdown rules and different working environments, this has led to a change in our environment, you know, where we work. Our behaviour then might have shifted. So you go up a level or into the circle. So our behaviour might have changed. You know, we're doing things slightly differently. Our shopping habits might have changed. We're communicating differently. We're communicating online. We might have had to learn some new skills. So there's an element of learning. You know, how are we changing and having to learn and adapt our approach? And we all have beliefs then about these changes to our lives and how they may affect our identity. And we were having a discussion about this model as a team, and Nick was asking why identity was at the centre. And, you know, it got me thinking, well, identity is at the root of our decision making. So it affects our behaviours, it affects our decisions that we make, it affects what we choose to learn, it affects our belief system. So it's really important that we think about our identity at the centre of this, and it has the ability to impact our belief system, what we choose to learn, how we develop ourselves, and how we turn up our behaviours at work. So I suppose just throwing it out to the team really. Matt, what has your experience been over the past year, and how might you relate this model to your experience? And do you feel like your identity has shifted?
Oh, very interesting question. Yes, to start you off with. Well, I think at an environmental level, I've experienced incredibly significant changes the last year. So that's where I feel it the most. I've moved from working in the city to working from home. I've moved from living in London to living in rural Scotland, and I've had another baby. So quite a lot of change, really. With all of that, as you might imagine, my behaviours have also changed quite a lot. Particularly the second baby thing, as I'm sure I don't need to explain to anyone who has 2 children. But also working from home. Again, I know this is something that everyone was probably feeling as well. I've actually been reflecting on how unusual it is. I think I don't currently feel a really significant shift in identity, given that there's loads of change in behaviour and at an environmental level. I think in part my work still anchors me to London a bit, which means I still quite strongly identify with the city, and it's given me sort of a steady purpose across this massive environment of change. Now, whether that change is something that I'm adjusting to is another question. So I suspect the answer to that is probably yes, and maybe in the next year I'll feel more of that shift of identity somewhere down the road. It might be sort of hard to put your finger on. What about you, Nick?
Yeah, the way I come at this is just thinking about Alembic, which we'd always seen as a London-based business. So I guess that's an identity statement about the business. It's a London-based business, and for me, just very rapidly as we hit the pandemic and everyone shifted out of the office completely during the first lockdown, I felt that identity really shift. I didn't see any need for us to maintain that kind of core sense of being a London-based business. We always served clients all over the place, and rarely in London, quite sometimes in London. But I guess the impact of finding that everyone could work effectively from anywhere opened my mind up immediately to the opportunity that presented to us to be in different places, to hire different people from different locations, to work anywhere, which I found quite exciting. And so while I don't think it's shifted completely, I think we'll always have an office in London. It makes sense for it to be a hub. It's a great, convenient place for people to come to from the south, certainly. I just don't feel that sense of even calling it a London-based business anymore, because I just don't think it is. So that's kind of weird impact.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that we can all go through a lot of change, and then there's a question about whether that does actually affect our identity. And Matt sharing his, having gone through lots of change, question whether that's changed his identity. And I think you also made the point there, Matt, that maybe this is just a snapshot in time, too close to the event. Maybe you're still going through it. There's still an adjustment period. Maybe there's a bit of a time lag on this to sort of let the way that your life is now sort of bed in, the way that you work bed in, the way that the organisation operates bed in, and there's sort of that transition. And so maybe it's just that lag, and it's a bit interesting to think about how what the shape of organisations, the shape of the way that we work might mean in the future, to relate to previous webinars, and actually how that might change our identity in the future. I think it also poses a question around whether we have a choice or not. So do we choose our identity? What happens when our environment shifts like it has done? Are we obliged to shift, or do we have a clear sense of who we are and we're quite grounded in that? We're quite fixed to our sense of identity. So here you can make a choice. Here are two paths. Do you feel able to make that choice? Which choice do you make? Do you accept the path that you're on and just cope, or do you feel that you can change? So quite a nice metaphor. We're all on a journey and we are all making choices. And that greater clarity of who we are helps you make those choices. But even whilst you're on that journey, sometimes things get uncomfortable, tough. Maybe you question those choices. And I think they just give you signs of, the sense of who you are. A reflection on my past year is that I had a lot of clutter in my life that was perhaps impacting my sense of self. And actually the past year has just cleared out a lot of stuff and a lot of that away, and it's left me with a greater sense of self and finding it helpful to take that concept of impermanence and apply that to my sense of identity, i.e. this path will serve me for however long it will do so, and actually to try not to identify too strongly with too many things has given me greater clarity on my root identity. So I guess the question is, what's your root identity? What do you have clarity on for yourself? And what are the few things? So that's going to help you make the choice about which path, and also when things get tricky. So I suppose just a question, what's your take on this idea of choice of identity, and maybe to what extent is it fixed? Matt, perhaps you want to take that one.
It's a tricky question, that one. We were talking about it when we were talking about this strategy cafe, and I did find it really difficult to think about an answer. I think differently from yourself, Roseanna, I tend to strongly identify with things. It's just something which is in my nature, I think. It's one of those things I suspect comes with pros and cons. Quite hard to say whether I think it's helpful or not. I suppose it's quite situational. On the positive side, it can give me an amazing sense of belonging and involvement. But then on the negative side, I think it probably makes it a bit harder to move away from things. So for a good example that I was thinking of was I used to identify as a runner, but when I eventually needed knee surgery and I couldn't run anymore, that was really difficult. So perhaps if I didn't feel it quite so strongly at an identity level and running was more of a behavior, that transition would have been a little bit easier for me. It's a difficult question to answer on many levels.
Yeah, I think yeah, identity is complex and it is difficult, and I think maybe just posing these questions today just will help people listening think and reflect about some of these questions. Also, just feel free just to pop in your thoughts, questions and comments. Maybe you disagree, maybe you want to challenge it, so that's all fun, and we welcome it. So just any thoughts you have, feel free just to put in the chat area. We'd love to see what you've got to say. I suppose just moving the conversation on then to how our identity impacts our belief system. So I'm just going to hand over to Nick, who's going to talk about this relationship between beliefs and identity.
Thanks, Rosanna. We actually had a question in from George Dye Wilson, which I'll just pick up quickly just as we get into this. So suggesting that majority of people believe their identity has changed only slightly, but probably a bigger shift in identity of colleagues. Do we think that it's harder to focus this question on ourselves? Maybe it's easier to focus it on other people, less challenging to focus it on other people than focusing on ourselves? And if so, what do we think are the implications for leadership? Maybe just pick that up briefly. Roseanna and Matt, interested in your comments on that. I guess for me, you can see that identity sits in the middle of the logical levels model. I would say if you have a strong sense of identity, it has a powerful impact on what you believe, and belief can be limiting or opening. So, think about that pathway, you identify really strongly, so well, the right-hand path is definitely mine, no question, and you're really confident about that. If your identity is not so strong in relation to this, because identity is always in relation to something, you can then not have a strong belief about it and feel unsure, uncertain. Or if you have a very weak identity, like you're not attached at all, pathway comes up, so changing path. I'm going left because I don't identify with this that strongly, and here's an opportunity. So I think it's a really powerful impact. And so I think the leadership thing is, for me, twofold. One is to understand self. Who am I, and how does that impact my beliefs? What does it limit me from doing? What does it open me up to? And then how do I tune into that with significant colleagues? Maybe before I just touch on that a bit more in this slide, have you guys got any response to George's question?
Yeah, I think my immediate reaction would be that it's very hard to reflect on yourself rather than see it in other people. Kind of as my answer to the previous question, my immediate sort of reaction was no, my identity has not changed. I am me. I don't feel any significant difference in my core identity. And that could be true, and it could be just skimming the surface. I think what's useful is to begin to think about it, to have a look at the logical levels, to have a look at what's changed in your environment and your behaviors, and to do a bit. It's going to take a bit of work to really consider whether you've had significant shifts in identity. I don't think it is something which comes naturally to easily see shifts in identity. You can tend to live your life on that sort of top level.
Mm.
Yeah, and I think we'll probably come on to this when we talk about, you know, the organisational shifts later on, in terms of, you know, how organisations have shifted, maybe pivoted and adapted in terms of what services they offer. And then from the employee's point of view, you know, what does that mean? I'm doing a different job, and how do I then relate to that job, and can I do that, and do I believe I have the right skill set, and, you know, is that something I want to do and feel connected to in terms of purpose? That will reflect on then, do I identify with this job, and is that a temporary shift or is that a permanent shift? So these might be questions that we have for our colleagues and peers around us.
Yeah, okay, so that's great. I'm just going to soften up this idea of identity a little bit. So I think we all have stronger or weaker, way of identifying with others and other things in our lives. We have layers upon layers of ways of identifying self to something else, like the clothes that you like to wear, the job you like to do, the people you like to be with, the stuff you like to interact with, you know, your hobbies, etc., etc. So there's a whole series of cascading relationships that we have across the whole spectrum of our lives, which are all formative of identity. Some of them are really strong, some of them are a lot weaker. And when you have this kind of like shift in the environment, obviously it impacts down the model, and that can shake those up a little bit. And a lot of people will be experiencing that. You know, maybe that earlier poll results have somewhat shifted is evidence of that. You know, it's cascaded across everybody to a degree. Does that shake up people's attachment to team, to your organization, to, you know, your purpose, etc.? And I'll leave Matt to chat about that in a little bit, but just referencing it back to change success model, which is a really powerful model for change. There are three core parts to this. I don't know whether you can see my mouse, but top left you've got beliefs, top right you've got readiness, and bottom you've got capability. And capability is really a hygiene factor. You've either got it or you haven't. So the enabling quadrants are really around beliefs and readiness. If you get your beliefs powerful and aligned, and you get really ready for it, then you'll always, you know, find a way to get the capability that you've got released to deal with the project or the change. And you can see that from DILTs, the beliefs element just, you know, firmly comes into the top left-hand quadrant here. So this is about my attitude. I've definitely seen people through the pandemic who didn't have strong attachment to business, like immediately, almost impulsively decide it was an opportunity to leave. So that's really a good example of how weak identification with something can be shattered quite easily with some sort of existential environmental shift, something to watch out for and be aware of. So my attitude is really important here. And I think the other thing that's just really important to note is just what is the belief and the attitude, that sense of strong identification of other significant people around you in your leadership team, you know, and where are they at? I think as a leader, it's worth just tuning in to that, asking questions, discussing it, and seeing where everybody is, being open to this discussion. If you have people in your team who, we call them here significant others, are, you know, influential amongst their colleagues, they'll be kind of thought leaders, emotional leaders, you know, and if they identify really strongly, that'll have an impact. And, you know, as a leader, you know what's going on in their minds, you know what they're thinking, do you know what they're saying? And maybe, you know, part of your job is to understand that and also be an influencer, a significant other to them. Maybe Matt can hand on to you to take this a little further.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Yep. I think it's kind of an important first point to make is that organizations and the people who work in them are not completely separate items. So many organizations tend to be made up in a large part by the sum of their people. A statement I'm sure you've heard made in different ways before. So this, of course, this is more pronounced in smaller organizations. So where any individual is going to be likely to have more influence over the business as a whole. So if you take an example of a small owner-managed business, in that case, the behavior or a change in behavior of the owner-manager is likely to be felt really directly at a business level. And while that's quite a simplistic and maybe obvious example, there are more complex and difficult examples to interpret in larger organizations. So one of note is the influence of organizational influences. So building on Nick's point on the change success model, So people who informally lead and influence staff and organizations. So while these might be the same people who are in managerial or leadership roles, that is by no means always the case. It can actually be quite difficult to spot who these people are, particularly if they fall outside of your kind of immediate social sphere. So that might be a good prompt to start to think about the influences in your business. Do you actually know who they are? If you don't, it's probably worth trying to find out. So by talking to your managers or by conducting a staff survey. Successfully implementing change in a business, as Nick pointed out with the model, can really hinge on the involvement of your organizational influences. So it's something which is really important to think about. So what this might mean for businesses is that as their people are experiencing changes in their identity, where this is happening in significant sort of proportionate numbers or with highly influential people, there's going to be an impact at an organizational level. So this is something which is important to consider, particularly as we continue our transition back to business as usual, or whatever business as usual is going to look like. Next slide, please. So while thinking about staff identity shifts is one angle to consider, there's another one as well. You probably consider the staff identity shifts as an internal angle, and then slightly more externally is thinking about customers and thinking about services. So there's no doubt that customer behavior has changed for the majority of businesses throughout the pandemic. For better or worse, slightly or significantly, there has been change. So with the change in customer behavior, how has your service provision shifted, or has it shifted at all? That again is a really important question when we consider potentially transitioning back to where we were before. So I've taken a restaurant as an example. So a business that has been really heavily impacted by the last 12 months. So if they've remained open at all, it's likely that their service provision has quite significantly shifted to meet new customer requirements. Now, for some restaurants, the move back to what they were doing before might be a perfect outcome. But for others, perhaps they've been providing a collection service during lockdown, which is doing really well. Maybe they found the gap in the market for deliveries in their local area. So these businesses might be in a position to consider a hybrid business model, or in extreme cases, maybe they're going to move away from what they were doing into a completely new space. Again, those are really clean-cut examples in business identity, where life is rarely so black and white or easy to interpret. However, it does beg the question, have you been doing things a little bit differently during lockdown? Has customer buying behavior changed, and have you altered service provision to meet it? Have identity lines become blurred, or have things completely changed and you're now unknowingly operating as a takeaway? Don't know. Some businesses, it might be a cue to have a look at that. In any case, with any significant period of change, it should have you considering your strategy to deal with the new landscape and kind of forge of that what you want. So start to consider how temporary your current setup really is, and whether it will suit the vision that you've got for your business future. I would think revisiting your business SWOT would probably be a good move at this point, if you've got one, and consider what's changed for you, consider what's changed for the business, and consider what's changed for your customers. Back over to you, Roseanna.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point around actually using this as an opportunity to revisit the strategy and the SWOT. I was just going to bring it back to this slide, because actually the change from an organizational level might just be that we're at a behavioral level need to sort of think about what behaviors we now need, what learning we need to provide to the organization to be able to respond to that shift. Some organizations, as you're saying, have pivoted hugely. Some organizations not so much. So that's where you can see actually from an organizational level you can apply this model and just think about where that change has sat. If organizationally your brand has sort of remained the same and clear, then maybe you're operating on those outer layers, and that's just an important thing just to give focus to how you're managing the change, and then going back to your strategy and your SWOT there. So it's 9:05, so just going to sum up on some of the key things that we've discussed today. So I suppose we've all changed because the world has changed, but our experience of this is different. For some it has been behavioural, and for others it has caused a shift in identity. So it's really interesting to have do the poll today to sort of get that feedback that actually it's only been a slight shift. So actually we need to look at more the behaviours and the beliefs and the capabilities that we're driving. So as we shift as individuals, so too does the organisation. So maybe apply that logical levels model to the organisation as well. Perhaps redo your SWOT. And then there's a question around whether this is temporary or permanent shift in business model, and just using some of the models we've discussed just to answer that question. And there should be thinking about whether there are levers, joiners, and how can you make that intentional and in line with your purpose as an organisation. So I've loved the chat and bringing it all together then. We've discussed in previous webinars and today sort of the big questions around identity, culture and change and how we interact with each other. I think this leads us nicely on to the next webinar, which we're going to be looking at driving high-performing teams in the future. We are moving along to this coral box here. So this is going to be the next strategy cafe, is on productivity, effective supervision and high performing teams. I suppose, how do we really drive productivity in this virtual environment? Yes, we're all starting to go back to the office, but to some extent that's still going to have a big virtual element. So how do we really boost positive behaviour, build capability and get to high performing teams? So that's going to be the next strategy cafe on Thursday the 6th of May. So just wrapping up there and just inviting some questions that you may have. Let's just have a look what we've got.
I've got one I can read out for you, Roseanna, and throw to you too. So there's one in the middle that we didn't pick up from David yet. I don't think an individual's identity changes. It's more about beliefs and behaviours. I think the focus of the discussion should be on the latter. Asking people to question their identity, I feel, is dangerous unless you're qualified to do so. Just curious as to both of you how you kind of pick up on that point about like the emotional resonance of identity.
Yeah, I mean, so I think the purpose of sort of going through the models is to show actually that change is operating at different levels. So I think where there's a focus and a need to build, what behaviours are we trying to drive, I think is an excellent question. What are the beliefs that we hold as individuals and as an organisation helps build our cultural map? So I think they're vital questions. I suppose posing the question around identity shift is maybe quite uncomfortable, but I think it goes back to the point where we all need that sense of who we are, and to assume that we all might have a clear sense of who we are, I think is also quite risky. And I think, to your point, Nick, it's that the leadership, actually having that sense of who we are, gives us great opportunity to lead. And so I think it's a helpful discussion. But I do think it doesn't preclude that actually we need to focus on what behaviours we're trying to drive, and what capabilities do we want to build to support the change.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, Roseanna. It's a very interesting question from David. I would say that rather than trying to tell people they must challenge their identity, presenting them with an explanation of the logical levels is a better way forward, so people can look at the levels and consider where things have changed. I think particularly where there has been obvious environmental changes, which are almost always likely to impact your behaviours somewhat, it's a good model to just have you thinking how deeply have these environmental changes penetrated this model for me. May not necessarily be a change in identity, but I think for people, particularly in leadership positions and people who are have sort of large staff in their businesses, it's something which is important to consider. Great.
I mean, I'll just maybe add to that by saying I wouldn't be overly worried about approaching the issue of identity. I think you've got to approach it sensitively and respectfully. So there's an important leadership component around understanding just how central a sense of self, a sense of identity is to people's self-confidence, sense of agency, sense of empowerment. It's obviously an emotional topic for people, to the extent that they can live out a sense of who they are properly in public. You know, there's more confidence and openness there, but a lot of people struggle with that. You know, so it's really important topic. And if you understand the model, yes, from a coaching perspective, you can go to sort of the more phenomenological sides of it. So, you know, behaviours and beliefs and capability is a really obvious place to go and a good place to learn. But understanding how people are building their sense of identity and how, you know, that is complex, and helping people discern some of the different elements of it and how they're overlapping is a really important part of leadership work in terms of releasing talent and capability. And so it's a great place for leaders to go. It does need a bit of work and confidence to get into it properly and understand the topic. But it can mean the difference between, you know, teams working incredibly well together and teams just not getting on at all. So it's a very important leadership topic, I think. Oh, David's just saying the chat box is not open. Sorry about that, David. I don't know why that is, but do you want, if you want to come back on any of that, if the chat box isn't working, just come back in on the questions.
Okay, just had a question from Adam around how does that relate to motivation? So really great question around motivation and identity. I always like to think of motivation as the energy. So it's, you take your purpose, a sense of who you are, and then actually what's going to get you motivated to live by that and follow that. And so I think motivation is a key part of the energy for driving the behaviour. So I think it starts with a sense of who you are, Adam. You know, what's your root identity, and then understanding what the motivational factors are for you, and they will be informed by your belief system, and they will impact your behavior. So why you do certain things will be related to your motivation, and your motivational sources come from that sense of who you are and that root identity. So I think if I were just to go back to sorry, if I just go back to this model, part of motivation is linked to your belief system as well. So it's operating in that sphere there. So it's just around the outside of identity. Matt or Nick, do you want to pick up on the point?
Maybe for the personal story for Adam. So I can remember being appointed as a partner in 2000. And I don't know whether I was suffering from, you know, what's it called where you don't believe in yourself properly? Thingy complex.
Imposter syndrome.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, I don't know whether I was suffering from imposter syndrome or what, but I found it quite hard for the first 6 months in a senior leadership post to believe that I was that, and found it very odd that people around me shifted their identity to me from more friend, colleague to slightly scary leader, and became instantly more inhibited. And there was kind of a period of adjustment to owning that identity as the leader properly and being comfortable with it. So I don't think that in that first 6 months I was really able to give full energy to my leadership because I wasn't confident in the identity. And it took me a while just to settle in and say to myself, yeah, okay, look, I have this. I have to own this for the firm. I have to hold this. I have to wear the clothes here. And at that point, I kind of start to step up into, you know, filling it out a little bit and being the leader that was needed. So it took me a while just to settle into it. So when I wasn't confident of my identity, my energy was inhibited. As I became more confident in my identity, my energy sort of left me and came out. You know, I was able to give that motivation, that drive. Yeah.
I think the good point as well is that, so you know, taking it in a different direction, is that we might be motivated by creativity and problem solving, you know, maybe our work and our job offers that, or maybe it doesn't. And I suppose then the question is, well, do I identify so strongly with this creator in me? Then maybe I try a hobby outside of work that allows me to exercise that, and, like, you know, thinking of that as an energy, being able to express that. And so it does relate to the whole sense of you, your whole identity. Sometimes at work you're motivated and not at home, and sort of just understanding the payoff and those different motivators. So, you know, there are lots of different sources of your motivation that will all feed into that sense of who you are. And you don't necessarily get all things from all activities. So just thinking about how you're balancing that work life and what's motivating for you.
Yeah, that's such a great point, and a great way of bringing out the best in the team is to understand what they identify with most and where that energy is, and whether that can be brought together in terms of, you know, relationships and work and with each other. That's a, you know, really great point.
Do we have any more questions? I'm just looking through. Thank you, George. I think George has signed off, but thank you for joining, George. And Libby's also had to go, so thank you to everybody who's joined. And thank you, Adam. Nice to see you online. And thank you, David, also for your questions. I think with that, if there's no more questions, I just think we'll wrap up there. But if you have sort of thoughts throughout the day, then feel free to send us an email. We'd love to continue the conversation offline. And hope to see you on our next Strategy Cafe, which will be on Thursday, the 6th of May. So thank you all very much for joining us today. It's lovely to connect. We'll get chat working next time, so sorry about that. And have a great day, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.